There's a special kind of pain in being told you're not enough, over and over, until you start to believe it yourself. For 32 years, Elira has carried that weight, living in the shadows where rejected omegas go to disappear. But hidden in her quiet nature is a gift more precious than gold. She can heal the deepest wounds of the heart. The Alpha King has ruled for decades with strength and wisdom, yet he's never known true peace until a chance meeting with this overlooked woman changes everything. She doesn't fit the mold of what a queen should be. The court sees her as too old, too simple, too broken. But when the most powerful man in the realm looks into her eyes, he sees home. What happens when two people who've given up on love find exactly what they've been searching for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the hillsides like whispered secrets, and Elira watched it dissipate from her kitchen window as she prepared her simple breakfast. Her cottage sat at the edge of the known world, where the northern realm's influence faded into wild, untamed lands. It was a place for the forgotten, the unwanted, the cast aside. She had made it her sanctuary. The cracked silver mirror above her washbasin caught the early light, fracturing her reflection into scattered pieces. Her mother's mirror, the only thing of value she'd managed to keep, when the shame of her failed bonding had driven her from civilized society 8 years ago. Some mornings she avoided looking at it entirely. Today, she paused before the weathered glass, studying the woman who stared back. 32 years had been kind to her, despite the hardships. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, fell in gentle waves past her shoulders. The lines around her green eyes spoke of laughter and tears in equal measure. She wasn't beautiful in the way court omegas were expected to be, all porcelain skin and delicate features. Her hands were calloused from years of tending her garden and caring for wounded travelers who occasionally stumbled upon her door. Her body carried the soft curves of a woman who had lived, who had known both joy and sorrow, but it was her eyes that held the real story. In their depths lay a gentleness that could soothe the most savage beast, a wisdom earned through suffering, and a capacity for understanding that few possessed. She was an empath in the truest sense, not just the rare magical gift that allowed her to sense and heal emotional wounds, but someone who had learned to see beyond surface appearances to the heart of things. The kettle whistled, drawing her from her reflection. As she prepared her morning tea, a blend of chamomile and wildflower honey, she heard the familiar sound of approaching footsteps on the rocky path that led to her door. Heavy, uneven steps. Someone injured. Elira set down her cup and moved to the door, opening it before the visitor could knock. A young man, barely past his 20th year, stood swaying on her threshold. Blood seeped through his torn shirt, and his face was pale with pain and exhaustion. "Please," he whispered before collapsing forward. She caught him with strength that belied her gentle appearance, half carrying, half dragging him to the simple cot she kept ready for such occasions. Over the years, word had spread among the marginalized communities that there was a woman in the borderlands who would help anyone, no questions asked. Thieves, outcasts, refugees from political upheavals, and sometimes just lost souls. Seeking a moment's peace, they all eventually found their way to her door as she examined the young man's wounds, knife cuts from what looked like a robbery gone wrong. She felt the familiar stirring of her gift. It wasn't something she could control or summon at will. It came when it was needed most, when someone's emotional pain ran so deep that physical healing alone wouldn't suffice. She cleaned and bandaged his wounds with practiced efficiency, but it was when she placed her hands gently on his forehead that the real healing began. The young man's eyes fluttered open, and in them she saw terror, shame, and a desperate loneliness that reminded her achingly of her own past. "You're safe now," she whispered, and meant it. The warmth spread from her hands into his troubled mind, not erasing his memories or changing what had happened to him, but offering him something more precious, the ability to carry his burdens without drowning beneath their weight. His breathing steadied, the wild panic in his eyes faded, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked truly peaceful. "What are you?" he asked in wonder. "Someone who understands," she replied simply. He stayed for 3 days, recovering not just from his physical injuries, but from whatever had driven him to the desperate circumstances that led to his attack. On the morning he left, he pressed a small wooden carving into her hands, a bird in flight, wings spread toward freedom. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me as more than my mistakes." After he disappeared down the mountain path, Elira returned to her cottage and placed the carving on the mantel alongside dozens of others, tokens of gratitude from those she'd helped over the years. Each one told a story of healing, of second chances, of hope restored. She settled into her worn leather chair and opened the journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Its pages chronicled not just her daily life, but her thoughts about the people who found their way to her door, her observations about the nature of healing and connection, and sometimes, though she rarely admitted it even to herself, her dreams of something more. Today she wrote, "The young man saw something in me that I sometimes forget exists. When I healed him, I felt an echo of who I used to be, before the shame convinced me I was broken. Mother used to say that our greatest gifts often come disguised as our deepest wounds." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps being unwanted taught me how to recognize and heal that same pain in others. She paused, pen hovering over the page, then added, "I wonder if there's someone out there who could see past my scars the way I see past others. But that's a foolish hope for a woman my age, especially one with my history." Outside her window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, moving fast across the darkening sky. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of hunting horns, unusual for this remote area. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled with an odd sense of anticipation, as if the very air had changed. She closed her journal and secured it back in its hiding place, then moved to secure her cottage against the coming storm. As she latched the shutters, her eyes caught movement on the far ridge, riders moving fast and heading directly for her valley. Something was different about today. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones, in the way the wind carried strange scents and stranger energies. After 8 years of peaceful isolation, change was coming whether she was ready for it or not. The storm broke just as the first rider reached her door. The pounding on her door came like thunder, urgent and demanding. Elira's heart raced as she unlatched the heavy wooden barrier she'd just secured against the storm. Rain lashed the threshold as she pulled the door open, revealing a figure she never expected to see in her remote sanctuary. The man who stood before her was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair plastered to his head by the driving rain. Even soaked and obviously in distress, there was something unmistakably regal about his bearing. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath, silver-gray and burning with an intensity that spoke of both great power and profound weariness. "Please," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "My men, we need shelter." Behind him, she could see other figures struggling through the storm, some helping their companions who appeared to be wounded. Without hesitation, she stepped aside and gestured them in. "Bring them inside, quickly." As they filed past her, 6 men in total, all bearing the marks of hard travel and recent conflict, she couldn't shake the feeling that she knew the face of their leader. There was something familiar about the strong line of his jaw, the commanding presence that even injury and exhaustion couldn't diminish. The last man through the door was clearly the most seriously hurt. Blood stained the makeshift bandage around his thigh, and his face was gray with pain. As his companions helped him to the cot where her previous visitor had recovered just days before, their leader finally spoke again. "You're hurt," Elira interrupted, noticing for the first time the gash across his forehead and the careful way he favored his left arm. "That's what matters right now." She moved efficiently around her small space, gathering supplies and lighting additional candles against the storm's gloom. Her visitors watched her with the wary gratitude of men accustomed to suspicion and betrayal. all except their leader, whose silver eyes followed her every movement with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Sit," she told him firmly, pointing to her kitchen chair. "You're bleeding more than you realize." For a moment she thought he might refuse. Men of obvious rank and authority weren't accustomed to taking orders from women like her. But something in her tone, or perhaps the simple kindness of being offered help without conditions, made him comply. As she cleaned the wound on his forehead, she became aware of something else bleeding beneath the surface. This man carried wounds that went far deeper than flesh, trauma that had settled into his very bones. The feeling grew stronger as she worked, until she could practically taste the bitter flavor of his inner torment. "What happened to you?" she asked softly, her hands gentle as she applied a healing salve. "Hunting expedition gone wrong," one of his men answered, when their leader remained silent. "Bandits. They've been growing bolder in these borderlands." But Elira's attention remained fixed on the man before her. Now that she was close enough to really study his features, recognition dawned like sunrise after a long night. The strong cheekbones, the silver eyes, the bearing that remained proud even in defeat. She had seen this face before. Carved in stone above the great gates of the capital city, she'd fled years ago. "You're the king," she whispered. Alpha King Aldrich of the Northern Realm looked up at her with those piercing silver eyes. And she saw something flicker there, surprise that she'd recognized him, perhaps, or wariness about what she might do with that knowledge. "I am," he said simply. His admission seemed to electrify the small space. His men shifted uncomfortably, hands moving instinctively to weapons they'd laid aside. They were clearly prepared for her to demand payment or favors, or any of the 100 things people usually wanted from royalty. Instead, she simply nodded and continued her work. "That doesn't change the fact that you're bleeding in my cottage," she said practically, "though it does explain why you carry yourself like the weight of the world rests on your shoulders." Something in his expression shifted at her words, surprise giving way to something that might have been relief. How long had it been, she wondered, since someone had spoken to him without ceremony or agenda? As she worked, she became increasingly aware of the turmoil radiating from him. It wasn't just physical pain or the immediate stress of their dangerous situation. This was the accumulated burden of years, decades, of impossible choices, betrayals endured, and necessities that had carved pieces from his soul. The blood-stained healing stone that hung from a leather cord around her neck began to warm against her skin, responding to her proximity to such deep emotional wounds. She glanced down at it, then back up at the king's face, torn between professional caution and an overwhelming urge to ease his suffering. "Your Majesty," one of his men called from across the room. "We should move on as soon as the storm passes. Every moment we delay, we're not going anywhere in this weather," the king said firmly, though his eyes never left Elira's face. "And our host has been more than generous." There was something in his voice, a note of genuine gratitude that suggested he wasn't accustomed to unconditional kindness. The realization tugged at something deep in her chest, and recognition of shared loneliness that transcended the vast gulf of their different stations. "You can all stay until the weather clears," she said, addressing the room but speaking primarily to him. "I have supplies enough, and there's a lean-to shelter behind the cottage for your horses." As she finished bandaging his forehead, her fingers accidentally brushed against his temple. The contact sent a shock through both of them, not of pain or surprise, but of connection so profound it took her breath away. For just an instant, she felt everything he carried, the crushing weight of crown and duty, the loneliness of power, the ache of never being seen for who he truly was beneath the titles and expectations. And somehow, incredibly, she sensed that he was experiencing something similar from her years of exile, her gentle strength, her capacity for healing that went beyond the physical. They stared at each other in stunned silence, both shaken by the unexpected intimacy of the moment. "What are you?" he asked, echoing the young man's words from days before. But unlike her previous visitor, there was no fear in his voice, only wonder and a hunger for understanding that spoke to something fundamental in her nature. Someone who recognizes pain when she sees it, she replied. Her voice barely above a whisper. The storm raged outside. But inside the small cottage, something profound had shifted. Neither of them fully understood what had just occurred. But they both felt it, a recognition, a possibility, a connection that defied logic and social boundaries. As the night wore on, and his men settled into whatever rest they could find, the king remained awake, watching Elira as she moved quietly around her home, tending to their needs with unconscious grace. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the constant tension in his shoulders began to ease. There was something about this woman, this gentle, overlooked Omega who lived at the edge of the world, that quieted the storm inside him in a way nothing else ever had. The blood-stained healing stone around her neck pulsed with a soft, steady light, visible only to those who possessed the rare gift to see it. And across the small room, Alpha King Aldrich watched its glow with growing wonder, beginning to understand that he had found something in this remote cottage that he hadn't even realized he'd been searching for his entire life. The king and his men departed with the dawn, but news of their unexpected shelter traveled faster than their horses could carry them back to the capital. By midday, Elira's quiet valley hummed with whispered conversations carried on the mountain winds. Word spread through the network of outcasts and borderland dwellers like wildfire. The Alpha King himself had spent the night in the cottage of the rejected Omega. He had spoken to her not as a subject but as an equal. More troubling still, those who claimed to have the sight swore they had seen her. Healing stone glow in his presence, something that hadn't happened since the ancient times when empaths were valued rather than feared. 3 days after the storm, Elira found herself with an unexpected visitor of an entirely different sort. Lord Commander Thane, the king's chief military advisor, arrived at her door with a formal escort and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the kingdom. His Majesty requests your presence at court, Thane announced without preamble, extending an ornate scroll sealed with the royal crest. Elira stared at the official summons as if it were a poisonous snake. I don't understand. Neither do I, Thane muttered under his breath before clearing his throat and adopting a more formal tone. The king has need of your particular services. She knew what he meant, though he couldn't bring himself to say it directly. Her empathic abilities had been recognized, categorized, and now she was being summoned like any other useful tool. The thought filled her with a familiar mixture of shame and resignation. I don't belong in court, she said quietly. That much is obvious, Thane replied with barely concealed distaste. His gaze swept over her simple woolen dress, her uncalloused hands, her lack of the elaborate grooming expected of court Omegas. However, His Majesty's will in this matter is absolute. The scroll felt heavy in her hands as she broke the seal and read the formal language within. It was couched in courtly phrases and diplomatic niceties, but the message was clear. She was to come to the capital immediately to serve in an advisory capacity. There was no mention of their moment of connection, no acknowledgement of the profound understanding that had passed between them during the storm. This was a royal command, nothing more. But at the bottom of the official text, written in a different hand, his hand she somehow knew, were 4 simple words that changed everything. Please. You are needed. Those words, so unlike the formal language of the rest of the document, sent a flutter of something she'd thought long dead through her chest. Not the foolish hopes of a young woman dreaming of romance, but the deeper recognition of one soul calling to another. I'll need time to prepare, she said finally. You'll have what time the journey takes, Thane replied curtly. We leave within the hour. The ride to the capital was a 3-day affair that felt like traveling to another world entirely. Elira had made the reverse journey 8 years ago in shame and haste, carrying nothing but her mother's mirror and the bitter taste of rejection. Now she traveled in the opposite direction with a royal escort, though she felt no less uncertain about her welcome. Lord Commander Thane proved to be surprisingly informative once they were on the road. perhaps feeling that knowledge might make her less of a liability at court. The king has been different since returning from the borderlands, he admitted as they made camp on the second night. More focused, but also more stubborn about certain matters. He's refused 3 perfectly suitable marriage proposals in the past month alone. Elira kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart performed an irregular rhythm at his words. The noble families are growing restless, Thane continued. The kingdom needs an heir, and His Majesty needs a political alliance. Instead, he summons a... He caught himself before completing what would undoubtedly have been an unflattering description. A rejected Omega from the borderlands, Elira finished for him. I'm well aware of how this looks, Lord Commander. Something in her tone made him study her more carefully in the firelight. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? Someone trying to use her encounter with the king for personal gain. Most would. Elira poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. I never asked to be summoned to court. I was content with my life. Were you? The question surprised her with its gentleness. Forgive me, but living alone at the edge of the world doesn't seem like contentment. It seems like hiding. She met his eyes across the flames and saw not the dismissive courtier she'd expected, but a man who genuinely cared about his king's welfare. Perhaps it was both, she admitted. The king needs people around him who see him as more than a crown, Thane said carefully. True loyalty is rarer than gold in the capital. If you possess it, you'll be more valuable than any political alliance. His words stayed with her as they completed their journey. When the spires of the capital finally came into view on the 3rd day, Elira felt her chest tighten with anxiety and anticipation in equal measure. The city was exactly as she remembered, magnificent and terrible in its display of wealth and power. The contrast with her simple cottage was so stark, it made her feel like she was wearing a costume in a play she didn't understand. But it was the castle itself that truly took her breath away. She had seen it before, of course, but only from a distance, and always with the bitter taste of rejection coloring her perception. Now, approaching through the main gates with a royal escort, she saw it as it was meant to be seen, a symbol of strength and continuity, of the enduring power that protected the realm. His Majesty is in meetings until this evening, Thane informed her as they entered the outer courtyard. You'll be given quarters in the east wing and time to... Prepare yourself for court. The dismissal in his tone was clear, but not unkind. She was being given the chance to transform herself from a simple borderland woman into something approaching courtly acceptability. Whether she chose to take advantage of that opportunity was up to her. The quarters she was assigned were modest, by royal standards, but luxurious beyond anything she'd known in years. A sitting room with tall windows overlooking the gardens. A bedchamber with a real bed rather than her simple cot. And most wonderfully, a bathing chamber with hot, running water. As she soaked away the travel dust and tried to calm her nerves, she caught sight of herself in yet another mirror, this one far clearer than her cracked silver one at home. The woman looking back at her was still unmistakably herself, but there was something different in her eyes. A spark of anticipation that hadn't been there in years. The servant girl who brought her evening meal also delivered a surprise, a gown of deep forest green silk, simple in cut but elegant in its very simplicity. From His Majesty, the girl said with a meaningful look. He thought you might find it suitable. Elira fingered the soft fabric and felt her cheeks warm. The king had thought about her comfort, her needs, even amid whatever pressures and responsibilities had filled his days since their return. It was a small kindness, but it spoke to the same consideration he'd shown in her cottage, seeing her as a person rather than merely a function. As night fell over the castle, she dressed carefully in the gifted gown and waited. Tomorrow would bring whatever trials court life held for a woman like her. Tonight, there remained only the promise held in 4 simple words. Please, you are needed. For the first time in 8 years, Elira allowed herself to hope that perhaps she truly was. The morning brought her first true taste of court life. and it was more bitter than she'd anticipated. Elira was summoned to the great hall before dawn, where she found herself facing a panel of court officials who regarded her with expressions ranging from skeptical curiosity to barely concealed hostility. At the center of the ornate table sat an artifact she recognized from historical accounts, the ancient bonding chalice, carved from a single piece of moonstone and inscribed with runes that were said to glow when touched by a true Omega-Alpha pair. "Lady Elira," began Lord Cassius, the king's chief advisor, and a man whose silver hair and sharp features spoke of decades navigating court politics. "His Majesty has seen fit to evaluate your suitability for a position of influence within the royal household. As such, certain assessments must be completed." She understood immediately what was happening. This was about more than advisory services or her empathic abilities. This was about the possibility, however remote the court might consider it, that the king's interest in her extended beyond the professional. "I understand," she said quietly, though every instinct screamed at her to flee back to her cottage, where such humiliations couldn't touch her. The first test was bloodline verification. A court genealogist examined documents that traced her family history back 3 generations, finding exactly what Elira had expected: honest working folk with no titles, no holdings, and certainly no royal connections. The man's disappointed expression spoke volumes about how this failure would be recorded. The second test was more personal and infinitely more mortifying. A court physician examined her for the markers that high-born Omegas were expected to possess, the delicate bone structure that spoke of generations of selective breeding, the unblemished skin that indicated a life free from manual labor, the soft hands that had never known calluses. Elira failed spectacularly. On every count, her hands show clear signs of physical labor, the physician announced to the assembled panel as if she weren't standing right there. Her skin bears the marks of sun exposure consistent with outdoor work. Her build suggests adequate nutrition, but lacks the refinement expected of noble breeding. With each pronouncement, she felt herself shrinking inward, returning to the shame that had driven her into exile 8 years before. She was being dissected like a specimen, catalogued and found wanting by every measure these people considered important. But it was the third test that proved most revealing. They brought forth the ancient bonding chalice and placed it before her with ceremonial gravity. According to legend, the chalice would react to the presence of an Omega destined for greatness, warming to the touch, glowing with inner light, or resonating with harmonic vibrations that could be felt by all present. "Place your hands upon the chalice," Lord Cassius commanded. Elira approached the artifact with growing dread. She knew what would happen. Nothing. The chalice would remain cold and dark, providing final proof that she was exactly what everyone already believed: a common woman with no special destiny, no royal future, no significance beyond the temporary whim of a king who had perhaps been grateful enough for shelter to confuse gratitude with something deeper. She placed her palms flat against the carved moonstone surface. For a moment nothing happened. The assembled court officials exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions ranging from satisfied vindication to poorly concealed relief. Here was proof that their concerns about the king's judgment were unfounded. Then the chalice began to warm. It wasn't the dramatic display of light and sound that the legends described. Instead, it was something far more subtle and, in its own way, more profound. The moonstone grew warm beneath her palms, and the carved runes began to emit a soft, steady glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. More significantly, every person in the room felt it, a wave of inexplicable peace that washed over the assembled courtiers like a gentle tide. Tensions they'd carried for years eased. Old grievances felt less sharp, and for just a moment, the constant undercurrent of political maneuvering that defined court life simply stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. "Interesting," Lord Cassius said finally, his voice carefully neutral. The chalice shows some response, though not of the traditional variety. Elira lifted her hands from the artifact, and immediately the sense of peace began to fade, leaving the courtiers looking somewhat dazed and oddly bereft. "What does it mean?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "It means," came a familiar voice from the hall's entrance, "that the chalice recognizes something the rest of you seem determined to overlook." Every head turned as King Aldrich entered the great hall, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. He was dressed in the formal regalia of state, but his silver eyes were fixed solely on Elira, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch, not just recognition, but genuine warmth. "Your Majesty," Lord Cassius rose hastily to his feet, "we were merely conducting the standard evaluations." "I can see what you are doing," the king interrupted, his tone carrying just enough edge to remind everyone exactly who held ultimate authority. "And I can see the results." He moved to stand beside Elira, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him. "The chalice responded to her presence," he continued, addressing the room but never taking his eyes from her face. "It recognized in her what I recognized 3 nights ago in a storm-battered cottage, something that cannot be measured by bloodlines, or breeding, or any of the other criteria you deem so essential." "But Your Majesty," another advisor protested, "surely you cannot mean to suggest that this person could be considered for a position of genuine influence. Her background, her education, her complete lack of preparation for court life, her ability to bring peace to a room full of politicians simply by touching an ancient artifact seems rather more impressive than any court education," the king replied dryly. Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks at his defense of her, but also a growing unease. She could see the expressions around the room, the mixture of shock, disapproval, and barely concealed outrage. These people had dedicated their lives to the intricate dance of court politics, and here was their king elevating a complete outsider based on what they undoubtedly saw as a momentary whim. "I would speak with Lady Elira privately," the king announced. "The rest of you are dismissed." The courtiers filed out with obvious reluctance, their whispered conversations beginning before they'd even cleared the hall. Elira found herself alone with the most powerful man in the realm, acutely aware of how the morning's tests had left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. "I'm sorry," he said quietly once they were alone. "I had hoped the evaluation would be more dignified." "They found me lacking in every traditional measure," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Perhaps they're right to be concerned." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see a woman who opened her door to strangers in a storm without thought for her own safety. I see someone whose very presence can calm a room full of adversaries. I see strength that doesn't need to announce itself, and wisdom that comes from genuine experience rather than inherited privilege." His words sent warmth spiraling through her chest, but they also carried a weight that frightened her. "Your Majesty," "Aldrich," he corrected gently, "when we're alone, I would prefer you use my name." The intimacy of the request made her pulse quicken, but it also sharpened her awareness of the impossible position she was being placed in. "Aldrich," she said carefully, "I think perhaps you should reconsider. These people know their world far better than I do. If they believe I'm unsuitable, they believe you're unsuitable because you threaten everything they think they understand about power and influence and worthiness," he interrupted. "But I've spent 20 years surrounded by people who meet every traditional qualification for their positions, and I've never known a moment's true peace until I sat in your cottage and felt the storm inside me finally quiet." The raw honesty in his voice made her heart ache. She could see the loneliness that surrounded him like a second skin, the isolation that came from being seen as a crown rather than a man. but she could also see the impossibility of bridging the gap between their worlds. "What are you asking of me?" she whispered. His smile was gentle but tinged with a sadness that spoke to her deepest empathic senses. "I'm asking you to stay, to let me discover what it might mean to have someone in my life who sees me rather than my position. To help me remember what peace feels like, standing there in the great hall, surrounded by the symbols of power and tradition that had shaped his entire life." Elira felt the weight of a choice that would determine not just her future, but his as well. The ancient bonding chalice sat silent on its ceremonial table, but she could still feel the echo of its warmth against her palms, a reminder that sometimes the most important truths couldn't be measured by conventional standards. Elira's decision to remain at court set off a chain of consequences she hadn't anticipated. Within days of the chalice testing, the carefully ordered world of royal politics began to shift around her presence like sand around a stone dropped into still water. The whispers started immediately, in corridors and alcoves, behind tapestries, and in shadowed doorways. The court buzzed with speculation about the king's mysterious protégé. Some called her his newest advisor, others whispered darker suggestions about her true role in the royal household, but all agreed on one thing: she didn't belong. Lady Cordelia Ravencrest, the most influential of the court's noble omegas, made her position clear during Elira's first formal dinner in the Great Hall. Cordelia was everything Elira was not: 25 years old, impeccably bred, beautiful in the sharp, crystalline way of perfect diamonds, and possessed of a political mind that could navigate court intrigue with deadly precision. How refreshing, Cordelia said with a smile that never reached her ice-blue eyes, to have someone so authentic joining us. It must be quite overwhelming, coming from such simple circumstances to all this grandeur. Her words carried the subtle venom of court speech, phrases that seemed complimentary on the surface but delivered their poison with surgical accuracy. Around them, other nobles listened with the avid attention of spectators at a blood sport. "It is certainly different from my cottage," Elira replied mildly, refusing to take the bait. "I imagine so, though I confess I'm curious about what's special. Skills you possess that have so captured His Majesty's attention." The implication was clear, and Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Perhaps," said Lord Marcus Blackthorne from across the table, "Lady Elira's skills lie in areas that are less easily displayed in polite company." The comment drew knowing chuckles from several quarters, and Elira realized she was experiencing her first taste of coordinated social warfare. These people had clearly planned this encounter, determined to establish her place in the hierarchy from the outset. But it was then that she became aware of something else, a subtle wrongness in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with social embarrassment. Her empathic senses, heightened by stress, detected an undercurrent of malice that went beyond mere social politics. Someone in this room harbored intentions far darker than simple social humiliation. Her gaze swept the assembled nobles, trying to identify the source of the malevolent energy, when she noticed Lord Blackthorne absently turning a heavy signet ring on his finger. The ring was ornate, carved with his family crest, but there was something about the way he handled it that made her uneasy. As she watched, he caught her attention and smiled, an expression that sent chills down her spine. "You look pale, Lady Elira," he said with false concern. "Perhaps the rich food doesn't agree with your simple constitution." "I'm quite well, thank you," she replied, but her attention remained fixed on that ring. There was something wrong with it, something that made her empathic abilities recoil as if from a source of poison. The dinner continued, with its undercurrent of subtle warfare, but Elira found herself increasingly distracted by what she was sensing from Lord Blackthorne. Beneath his polished exterior lay a rage so deep and corrosive that it took her breath away. This wasn't the ordinary ambition and resentment that seemed to permeate court life. This was something far more dangerous. When the king finally arrived, delayed by urgent military dispatches, the atmosphere in the hall shifted noticeably. Conversations became more animated, laughter more genuine, and the subtle hostility that had surrounded Elira seemed to retreat into the shadows. Aldrich took his place at the head table, his eyes immediately seeking hers across the room. When their gazes met, she saw his expression soften with something that might have been relief. Even from a distance, she could sense his exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but the deeper weariness of a man who carried too many burdens alone. "My apologies for the delay," he announced to the hall. Affairs of state rarely observe social schedules. His presence transformed the dinner from a subtle inquisition into something approaching normalcy. But Elira remained troubled by what she'd sensed from Lord Blackthorne. As the evening wound down, she found herself studying the man more carefully, noting the way his hand returned repeatedly to that strange ring, the calculating look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. After the formal dinner concluded, Aldrich approached her with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Walk with me," he said simply, offering his arm. They strolled through the castle's moonlit gardens, leaving the political tensions of the great hall behind them. Here, surrounded by the timeless beauty of carefully tended roses and ancient oak trees, it was easier to forget the complexities that surrounded their unlikely connection. "You seemed troubled during dinner," he observed as they paused beside a fountain whose gentle splash masked their conversation from any potential eavesdroppers. "Your court is more complicated than I anticipated," she admitted. "They're testing you," he said matter-of-factly. "It's what they do with anyone new, especially someone who threatens their established order." "And do I? Threaten their order, I mean." He turned to face her fully, his silver eyes serious in the moonlight. "More than you know." Before she could ask what he meant, he continued, "There are factions in the court who have grown comfortable with the way things are. They've built their power on the assumption that influence flows through traditional channels, bloodlines, marriages, inherited positions. Your presence here suggests that I might value different qualities." "What qualities?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Honesty, compassion, the ability to see past surface appearances to the truth beneath." His hand rose to cup her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart race. "The capacity to bring peace instead of constantly stirring conflict." The touch of his skin against hers sent warmth spiraling through her entire body, but it also triggered her empathic abilities more strongly than ever before. Through the connection, she felt the depth of his attraction to her, but also something else, a bone-deep loneliness that made her ache with sympathy. "Aldrich," she whispered, leaning into his touch despite her better judgment. "I know this is complicated," he said softly. "I know there are 100 reasons why this can't work, why you shouldn't be here, why I should have left you in peace in your cottage. But for the first time in 20 years, I can envision a future that doesn't feel like an endless series of political obligations and strategic marriages." His thumb traced across her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "When I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to simply be a man rather than a crown." The raw honesty in his voice broke down the last of her defenses. Standing there in the moonlit garden, surrounded by the whisper of ancient trees and the music of flowing water, she could almost believe that love might be stronger than politics. That connection might triumph over convention, almost. "What you're suggesting, what we're both feeling, it could destroy everything you've worked for," she said, though the words cost her dearly. "Or it could save me from a life that's slowly killing my soul," he replied. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them spring apart. Lord Commander Thane emerged from the shadows, his expression apologetic but urgent. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but there's been a development. The border scouts report unusual activity from the Eastern Kingdom. Lord Cassius requests an immediate council meeting." The moment shattered like glass, returning them instantly to the realities of duty and responsibility. Aldrich's expression shifted from lover to king in the space of a heartbeat. though his eyes lingered on her face with obvious reluctance. "Of course," he said formally. "I'll be along directly." After Thane disappeared back toward the castle, Aldrich turned to her one final time. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Whatever forces are aligning against us, whatever challenges we face, I want you to know that you matter to me. Not as an advisor or a political asset, but as yourself. That's not going to change." As he strode back toward the castle and his waiting responsibilities, Elira remained in the garden, her mind churning with everything that had transpired. The king's feelings for her were clearly deepening beyond mere gratitude or political convenience. But that only made their situation more dangerous. She thought again of Lord Blackthorn's poison ring and the malevolent energy she'd sensed radiating from him throughout dinner. Whatever plots were brewing in the shadowed corners of the court, she had a growing certainty that they involved more than social positioning or political maneuvering. Someone wanted her gone, and they were willing to go to deadly lengths to achieve that goal. As she finally made her way back to her quarters, Elira couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle for her place in this world was only just beginning. And unlike the social warfare she'd experienced at dinner, she suspected the next phase would be fought with weapons far more dangerous than words. The attack came 3 days later. Swift and silent in the pre-dawn darkness, Elira woke to the sound of her chamber door opening with the careful quiet of someone who didn't want to be heard. Her years of living alone on the borderlands had trained her to sleep lightly, and she was fully alert within seconds. Though she kept her breathing steady and her eyes closed, footsteps whispered across the stone floor, 2 sets, moving with the practiced stealth of professionals. Assassins, then, not common thieves or opportunistic courtiers. Someone had hired killers. Her hand moved slowly beneath her pillow, searching for the small eating knife she'd taken to keeping there since arriving at court. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. As her fingers closed around the familiar handle, she heard one of the intruders whisper something too low to make out. That's when the first real attempt on her life began. She rolled from the bed just as a crossbow bolt thudded into the pillow where her head had been a moment before, feathers exploding in a cloud that caught the faint moonlight. Without thinking, she hurled her knife at the crossbow wielder, more to distract than to kill, and was rewarded by a curse as the blade caught him across the forearm. "She's awake," the wounded assassin hissed to his companion. "Then finish it quickly," came the harsh reply. But Elira was already moving, her empathic abilities flooding her with information about her attackers. The wounded one was afraid now, his confidence shaken by the failure of their surprise attack. The other was coldly professional, adjusting his strategy without emotion. More dangerous, she made it to the door of her sitting room before the second assassin caught her, his arm snaking around her throat in a hold designed to silence her permanently. But as his skin made contact with hers, something unexpected happened. Her empathic gift, heightened by mortal terror, didn't just read his emotions. It projected her own. The overwhelming fear and desperation she felt crashed into his mind like a physical blow, disrupting his concentration just long enough for her to break free and scream for help. The sound echoed through the castle corridors like a war horn. Within moments, she could hear the thunder of approaching footsteps and the bark of shouted orders. Her attackers, realizing their mission had failed, fled through the window they'd used to enter, disappearing into the night like shadows. King Aldrich was the first to reach her chamber, arriving with sword drawn and wearing only hastily donned trousers and boots. Behind him came a stream of guards, servants, and courtiers, drawn by the commotion. "Elira!" He dropped his sword and gathered her into his arms, his hands running over her body to check for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "I'm all right," she managed, though she was shaking violently from the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. "They came to kill me." "Who?" His voice carried a deadly quiet that reminded everyone present exactly how dangerous a man they were dealing with. She gestured toward the crossbow bolt still embedded in her pillow. The scattered feathers, the small spray of blood where her knife had found its mark. Professional assassins. 2 of them. They knew exactly how to get into the castle where my chambers were located, how to move unseen. Lord Commander Thane had arrived and was already examining the evidence with the practiced eye of a military man. Inside knowledge, he confirmed grimly. This wasn't a random attack or opportunistic crime. Someone with access to the castle layouts and guard rotations planned this. The implications hung heavy in the air. There was a traitor in the court, someone close enough to the center of power to orchestrate an assassination attempt within the castle walls themselves. King Aldrich's expression had shifted from concern to something far more dangerous. "Double the guard on Lady Elira's chambers," he commanded, "and I want every person who had access to information about her quarters questioned. Someone will answer for this." As the immediate crisis subsided and the various officials began their investigations, Aldrich drew Elira aside to a private alcove where they could speak without being overheard. "This confirms what we both suspected," he said quietly. "Your presence here threatens someone enough that they're willing to commit murder to remove you." "But who?" she asked, though her mind immediately went to Lord Blackthorn and that strange poison ring. "That's what we're going to find out." His hands cupped her face with infinite gentleness, a stark contrast to the steel in his voice. "But first I need you safe. This attack was too well planned, too professionally executed, to be an isolated incident. They'll try again." The thought sent fresh fear coursing through her. But it was tempered by something else, a growing realization of what her continued presence at court might cost not just her, but him as well. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "it would be better if I returned to my cottage. If I'm not here, they have no reason to—" "No." The word came out with such force that several nearby guards turned to look. He moderated his tone but not his intensity. "I won't let them drive you away through terror. That would be letting them win. But the cost of letting fear dictate our choices is always higher than the cost of standing firm," he interrupted. "Besides, running now won't guarantee your safety. If someone is willing to murder you to prevent your influence here, what makes you think they'd let you live in exile?" The logic was sound but terrifying. She was trapped now, caught between the deadly politics of court and the impossibility of true escape. "What do we do?" she whispered. His smile was grim but determined. "We find out who's behind this, and we make them pay for their treachery." The investigation began immediately, but it quickly became clear that whoever had orchestrated the attack had covered their tracks expertly. The assassins had vanished completely, leaving behind only the crossbow bolt and a few drops of blood from the one Elira had wounded with her knife. More troubling still were the broader implications of the attack. Word of the assassination attempt spread through the court like wildfire, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that affected everyone. Nobles, who had previously merely disapproved of Elira's presence, now began to wonder if association with her might make them targets as well. It was during the second day of investigations that Elira made a disturbing discovery. While reviewing the list of people who had access to information about her quarters, she noticed Lord Blackthorn's name. More significantly, she realized she hadn't seen him since the night of the attack. When she mentioned this to Lord Commander Thane, his expression grew troubled. "Now that you mention it, Lord Blackthorn requested permission to visit his estates yesterday morning. Said he had urgent family business that couldn't wait. Rather convenient timing," Elira observed. "Indeed," Thane made a note in his ledger. "I'll send riders to verify his whereabouts and escort him back to court for questioning," but it was too late. When the riders reached the Blackthorn estates, they found them deserted, except for a few loyal servants who claimed their lord had departed for parts unknown, taking only what he could carry and leaving no indication of his intended destination. The news hit the court like a thunderbolt. Lord Blackthorn, a man whose family had served the crown for generations, had apparently fled in the night rather than face questions about his possible involvement in an assassination attempt. "It doesn't prove he was involved," King Aldrich said when the news was delivered, though his expression suggested he believed otherwise. But it certainly suggests guilty knowledge. The poison ring, Elira said quietly. The night of the dinner, I sensed something wrong about the ring he wore. Something that made my empathic abilities recoil. Aldrich's eyes sharpened with interest. Poison ring? I believe so. There was a wrongness about it, a malevolent energy that felt like concentrated hatred. Lord Commander Thane leaned forward. A poison ring would explain how the assassins got past the castle's food tasters and other precautions. They weren't planning to use conventional weapons alone. The implications were chilling. Not only had someone tried to have Elira murdered in her bed, but they'd also prepared backup methods involving poison, suggesting a level of planning and determination that went far beyond a single night's work. As the investigation continued and the web of conspiracy began to unravel, one thing became increasingly clear. The attack on Elira was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger plot that threatened not just her life, but the stability of the entire kingdom. And at the center of it all was a growing certainty that her relationship with the king and the changes it might bring to the established order was worth killing to. Prevent the sound that had awakened her that night hadn't been just the opening of her chamber door. It had been the opening salvo in a war she was only beginning to understand. Standing at the window of her heavily guarded quarters, looking out at the castle grounds, where even now unknown enemies might be watching and planning, Elira realized that her choice to stay at court had set forces in motion that none of them could fully control. But as frightening as that realization was, it was tempered by something else. The memory of Aldrich's hands on her face, the steel in his voice when he'd refused to let fear drive her away, and the growing certainty that whatever battles lay ahead, she wouldn't be facing them alone. From somewhere in the distance came the haunting call of a war horn, carried on the evening wind like an omen of conflicts yet to come. The discovery came by accident, hidden in the most unlikely of places, 3 days after Lord Blackthorn's flight, while Elira was sorting through her few possessions to make room for the additional guards now stationed in her chambers. Her fingers brushed against the small locket she wore beneath her clothing. Her mother's locket, the only piece of jewelry she'd ever owned. The locket had been her most treasured possession since childhood. A simple silver heart that contained a tiny portrait of the mother she'd lost when she was barely 16. But as she touched it now, something felt different. The metal was warm against her skin in a way it had never been before, and there was a subtle vibration coming from within, as if something inside was responding to her heightened empathic abilities. Curious, she examined the locket more carefully than she had in years. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The locket was larger than she'd remembered, its edges more intricate. As she studied it in the bright afternoon light streaming through her window, she realized there was a second compartment she'd never noticed, a hidden panel so skillfully concealed that it had remained undetected for over 15 years. With trembling fingers, she pressed the tiny catch that opened the secret compartment. Inside was another portrait, this one even smaller than her mother's, but the face that stared back at her from the miniature painting was unmistakably familiar. Strong features, silver-grey eyes, and the distinctive bone structure that marked the royal bloodline of the Eastern Kingdom. Lord Aldwyn Ravencrest, King of the Eastern Realm, the most powerful alpha in the neighboring kingdom, and according to the court genealogies, a man who had died without legitimate heirs nearly 30 years ago. Except that wasn't entirely true, was it? Elira stared at the portrait until her eyes began to water, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. The mathematical impossibilities arranged themselves with horrible clarity. She was 32 years old, which meant she'd been born exactly 9 months after the last recorded visit Lord Aldwyn had made to the Northern Realm. Her mother, Lyanna, had been a lady-in-waiting to the Northern Queen at that time, a position that would have brought her into contact with visiting dignitaries, and her mother had never spoken of Elira's father, claiming only that he had been a good man who couldn't stay. The locket slipped from nerveless fingers as the full implications crashed over her like a physical blow. She wasn't just some rejected Omega from the borderlands. She was the illegitimate daughter of the Eastern King, a princess in exile who had been hidden away to prevent the exact kind of political upheaval her existence would have caused, her failed bonding. 8 years ago, the shame that had driven her into exile suddenly took on an entirely different meaning. It hadn't been failure at all. It had been sabotage, engineered by someone who knew exactly what she was and wanted to ensure she never discovered her true heritage. But who? And why now, after all these years, were they trying to kill her? The answer came with a knock at her door that made her heart nearly stop beating. "Lady Elira?" came a familiar voice. "It's Lord Cassius. His Majesty requests your immediate presence in his private study." Elira quickly retrieved the locket and closed both compartments, her mind still reeling from what she'd discovered. But as she prepared to leave her chambers, another realization struck her with the force of a lightning bolt. If she was Lord Aldwyn's daughter, that made her the legitimate heir to the Eastern Kingdom's throne. It also made her potential marriage to King Aldric not just personally significant, but politically revolutionary. A union between the northern and eastern realms, sealed by royal blood from both kingdoms, could reshape the entire balance of power in their world. It could also provide the perfect motive for assassination. Lord Cassius was waiting outside her door with an escort that seemed unusually large and well-armed for a simple walk to the king's study. As they moved through the castle corridors, Elira found herself studying the elderly advisor with new eyes, wondering how much he knew and whether he could be trusted with the explosive secret she now carried. The king's private study was located in the castle's oldest tower, a circular room lined with ancient books and historical documents that had been collected over centuries of rule. King Aldric was standing by the tall window when she entered, his silhouette dark against the afternoon sky. "Your Majesty," she began formally, but he turned and held up a hand to stop her. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "and I think it's time for complete honesty between us." Something in his tone made her pause. There was a weight to his words that suggested he, too, had discoveries to share. "Close the door," he instructed Lord Cassius, who complied and then took up a position that clearly indicated he was prepared to prevent anyone else from entering. "What I'm about to tell you," Aldric began, moving away from the window to face her directly, "must never leave this room. The stability of both kingdoms depends on it." Elira felt the locket's weight against her chest like a burning coal. "Both kingdoms? 3 days ago, my intelligence network discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about the recent threats against your life." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. Lord Blackthorn wasn't acting alone. He was being paid by agents of the Eastern Kingdom, specifically by people who claimed to represent the interests of the rightful heir to their throne. The words hit her like physical blows. The rightful heir? Someone whose existence has been kept secret for over 30 years. Someone whose claim to the Eastern throne is so legitimate that her emergence could destabilize the entire political landscape of both our kingdoms. Elira's hand rose unconsciously to touch the locket beneath her dress. Her? King Aldric's silver eyes never left her face. Lord Aldwyn Ravencrest's daughter, born in secret and hidden away to prevent a succession crisis that could have led to civil war. The silence that followed was deafening. Elira felt as though the ground beneath her feet had turned to quicksand. Everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world, shifting and reforming into impossible new patterns. "You know," she whispered, "I suspected from the moment I saw you in your cottage," he admitted. "The bone structure, the eyes, the innate dignity that no amount of hardship could erase. But I wasn't certain until my agents confirmed it 3 days ago. How long have you known about the locket?" His smile was gentle, but tinged with sadness. "Since yesterday, when Lord Cassius's investigation revealed that your mother had been entrusted with certain safeguards Before your birth, Lord Cassius stepped forward, his expression grave. Your mother was far more than a simple lady-in-waiting. Lady Elira, she was Lord Aldwyn's most trusted agent, and charged with protecting his daughter until such time as it became safe to reveal the truth. But it never became safe, Elira said, the pieces finally falling into place. Because revealing my existence would have meant war between the kingdoms. Exactly, Aldrich confirmed. Your very existence represents the possibility of unifying the northern and eastern realms under a single crown, something that terrifies certain factions in both kingdoms who profit from the current divisions, and Lord Blackthorne was being paid to eliminate you before that possibility could be realized, Lord Cassius said grimly. The assassination attempt was just the beginning. Our intelligence suggests there are other plots in motion, other agents working to ensure you never live to claim your birthright. Elira sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd learned. In the space of an afternoon, she'd gone from rejected Omega to hidden princess, from potential royal advisor to the key to a political revolution that could reshape their world. What happens now? She asked quietly. King Aldrich moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness. Now we face a choice that will determine the future of both our kingdoms. We can keep your identity secret, protect you from those who would use or destroy you, and allow you to live quietly as my advisor. Or we acknowledge what you are, claim your rightful place as heir to the Eastern throne, and unite our kingdoms through the bond that already exists between us. The weight of destiny settled on her shoulders like a mantle of lead. Everything she'd ever dreamed of, love, acceptance, a place in the world, was being offered to her. But the price was higher than anything she'd ever imagined. If we choose the second path, she said carefully, how many people will die in the wars that follow? Perhaps none, Aldrich replied. A legitimate union between the royal houses could prevent conflict rather than cause it. But there are no guarantees, and if we choose the first, then we live with the knowledge that we had the power to change the world and chose safety instead. Outside the tower window, the sun was setting over the castle grounds, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the momentous nature of the decision before them. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of the evening bells calling people to their dinners, to their families, to their simple, uncomplicated lives she would never be able to live. Standing up from the chair, Elira walked to the window and looked out at the kingdom spread below, the kingdom that might someday be hers to rule, to protect, to serve. In her hand, the locket seemed to pulse with warmth, as if her parents' love was reaching across the years to guide her choice. When she turned back to face the two men who had just changed her life forever, her expression was calm but determined. Tell me about these other plots you mentioned, she said quietly. Because if there are people out there who think they can use fear and murder to control the future of two kingdoms, I believe it's time they learned exactly what kind of woman they're dealing with. The hidden princess had awakened, and she was ready for war. The war council that convened that night was unlike any in the Northern Kingdom's history. Instead of grizzled generals planning military campaigns, it brought together spymaster, diplomat, and royal guard to forge a strategy that would either unite two kingdoms or destroy them both. Maps of both realms covered the great oak table in the king's private war room, marked with colored pins indicating troop movements, supply lines, and the locations of known conspirators. At the center of it all sat the battle standard of unity, a hastily created banner that combined the silver wolf of the northern realm with the golden eagle of the eastern kingdom, its rich blue silk catching the candlelight like a promise of hope. Our intelligence network has identified at least 3 separate plots against Lady Elira's life, Lord Commander Thane reported, his voice grim in the flickering light. The failed assassination was just the opening move. They're planning something far more ambitious. Master Garrett, the Crown's chief spy master, leaned forward over the maps. The Eastern Kingdom's current regent, Lord Voss, has been working with a faction of northern nobles to ensure that Lady Elira never lives to press her claim. He's been embezzling from the Eastern Treasury to fund this conspiracy for months. King Aldrich studied the tactical positions with the eye of a man who had spent decades navigating political warfare. What's their next move likely to be? Public execution disguised as mob justice, Master Garrett replied bluntly. They're planning to stage a riot during the Harvest Festival next week. In the chaos, hired assassins will eliminate Lady Elira while making it look like she died in the general violence. The casual brutality of the plan sent chills through everyone present. The Harvest Festival was the Northern Kingdom's most sacred celebration, a time when thousands of citizens gathered in the capital to give thanks for the year's bounty. Using such a holy occasion as cover for murder was a desecration that spoke to the conspirators' complete lack of honor. How many people are we talking about? Elira asked quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since the council convened, and her voice carried a quality that made everyone listen more intently. At least 50 confirmed conspirators spread between both kingdoms, Thane answered. But the riot itself could involve hundreds of innocent people who don't know they're being manipulated. Elira absorbed this information with the calm that had surprised everyone who'd gotten to know her over the past weeks. The frightened Omega who'd arrived at court had been replaced by someone with steel in her spine and wisdom beyond her years. The revelation of her true heritage had awakened something dormant in her nature, not arrogance or entitlement, but a deep sense of responsibility for the people who might die because of the accident of her birth. What are our options? She asked. Lord Cassius, who had been unusually quiet during the briefing, cleared his throat. Traditionally, we would either eliminate the threat through preemptive action or remove you to safety until the danger passed, neither of which addresses the underlying problem, Aldrich observed. Kill these conspirators, and others will take their place. Take Elira away, and they'll simply wait for another opportunity. Then what do you propose? Master Garrett asked. It was Elira who answered, her voice steady and thoughtful. We turn their plan against them. We use the festival as an opportunity to reveal the truth and let the people decide for themselves what kind of future they want. The silence that greeted this suggestion was heavy with implications. What she was proposing went far beyond simply foiling an assassination plot. It was a complete transformation of the political landscape. You're talking about publicly claiming your birthright, Thane said slowly, in front of thousands of witnesses from both kingdoms. I'm talking about ending 30 years of lies and conspiracy, she replied. The people deserve to know the truth about who I am and what my existence means for their futures. King Aldrich leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression of mingled admiration and concern. It's incredibly dangerous. If the crowd rejects your claim, if they see you as a threat to stability rather than a bridge to peace, you could be torn apart before we could protect you. And if they accept it, then we'll have achieved something that hasn't been possible in 3 centuries, the voluntary unification of 2 kingdoms under a joint crown. The weight of history settled over the war room like a physical presence. They were discussing changes that would affect not just their own lives, but the lives of millions of people across both realms. The responsibility was staggering. There's something else we need to consider, Lord Cassius said quietly. If Lady Elira publicly claims her heritage and the people accept her, it changes the nature of your relationship with her entirely, Your Majesty. You would no longer be a king, taking a common-born advisor as his mate. You would be entering into a royal marriage between equals. The implications of this observation rippled through the room. Such a marriage would need to be negotiated like a treaty between sovereign nations, with all the ceremony and political complexity that entailed. But it would also legitimize their relationship in a way that no amount of royal decree could achieve. Is that what you want? Aldrich asked her directly, his silver eyes intense in the candlelight. The question hung in the air between them, fraught with personal and political significance. Elira looked around the war room at the faces of the men who had gathered to protect her, to plan for her future, to risk their own lives for the possibility of peace between their kingdoms. But it was the banner at the center of the table that decided her, the battle standard of unity with its intertwined symbols of wolf and eagle, its promise of strength through cooperation rather than domination through conquest. "I want," she said carefully, "to build something worthy of the sacrifices that will be required to achieve it. I want to create a future where young women don't have to hide their gifts or their heritage out of fear, where strength is measured by the ability to heal rather than the power to destroy." She paused, her gaze meeting Aldrich's across the table. "And I want to do that with a man who sees me as a partner rather than a prize to be won." His smile was radiant in its intensity. "Then we'd better make sure we both survive the next week." The planning that followed was meticulous and complex, requiring coordination between military units, intelligence networks, and diplomatic channels that spanned both kingdoms. They would have one chance to execute their strategy successfully. If they failed, the consequences would be measured not in personal disappointment, but in civil war and the deaths of thousands. Master Garrett's network would identify and neutralize the key conspirators before they could trigger the planned riot. Lord Commander Thane's guards would provide security for the public revelation, positioned throughout the festival crowd to prevent violence. And Lord Cassius would coordinate with loyal allies in the Eastern Kingdom to ensure that Elira's claim would be recognized and supported by the legitimate nobility. But the most crucial element of their strategy rested on Elira herself, her ability to convince a crowd of thousands that she was not a threat to their way of life. "But the key to a better future, you'll need to speak from the heart," Aldrich advised, as they planned her address to the assembled masses. "These are simple people, farmers and craftsmen and merchants. They don't care about bloodlines or political theories. They care about whether their families will be safe, whether their children will have better lives than they did. What if I'm not what they expect a princess to be?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since the decision was made. "I don't have the training, the education, the refined manners that royalty is supposed to possess." "You have something better," he replied firmly. "You have the ability to understand their struggles because you've lived them. You can speak to their hearts because yours has been broken and healed the same way theirs have." The days leading up to the festival passed in a blur of preparation and barely controlled tension. Elira found herself transformed by a team of court advisors who helped her strike the perfect balance between royal dignity and approachable humanity. The gown they chose for her was elegant but not ostentatious, deep blue silk that complemented her auburn hair, with silver embroidery that echoed the Unity banner's design, but it was the jewelry that carried the most significance. Instead of the elaborate crown jewels that protocol would normally demand, she would wear only two pieces: her mother's locket, now openly displayed as a symbol of her hidden heritage, and a simple silver circlet that had been hastily forged to incorporate both kingdoms' royal symbols. "You look like a queen," Aldrich said when he saw her final appearance, and there was something in his voice that suggested he meant more than just her physical transformation. "I feel terrified," she admitted. "Good. That means you understand the magnitude of what we're attempting." He took her hands in his, thumb brushing over her knuckles with infinite tenderness. "But you don't have to face this alone. Whatever happens out there, we face it together." The morning of the harvest festival dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that spoke of change coming whether people were ready for it or not. By sunrise, thousands of people had already gathered in the great square before the castle, their voices creating a low murmur of excitement and anticipation that could be felt even in the highest towers. From her window, Elira could see the scope of the crowd and feel her nerves tighten with each passing hour. These were the people whose lives would be affected by the choices she made today, their hopes and fears, their futures and their children's futures. All rested on her ability to convince them that unity was stronger than division. "The conspirators are in position," Master Garrett reported during their final briefing. "Lord Blackthorn himself has been spotted in the crowd, along with at least a dozen of his hired assassins. They're planning to make their move during the traditional address to the people. And our people. Ready, at your signal we'll move to neutralize the threats. But you'll need to keep the crowd calm while it happens, or we'll have chaos regardless." King Aldrich checked his own weapons one final time, not the ceremonial sword of state, but the practical blade he'd carried into real battles. "Today might require both king and warrior. Are you ready?" he asked Elira as they prepared to make their way to the great balcony that overlooked the festival square. She touched the locket at her throat, feeling the warmth of her parents' love across the years, then placed her hand over the battle standard that would be unfurled as part of the ceremony. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm ready anyway." As they walked through the castle corridors toward their destiny, Elira felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Somewhere in the crowd below, enemies waited to destroy her before she could speak her truth. But also, in that crowd, were people who might be willing to embrace a future built on hope rather than fear, on cooperation rather than conflict. The sound of thousands of voices rose to meet them as they approached the balcony. A wall of sound that spoke of anticipation, excitement, and the raw energy of a people gathering to celebrate their shared heritage. In moments, she would step before them, not as the rejected Omega who had fled this place in shame 8 years ago, but as a princess claiming her birthright and offering them a choice that would echo through the generations. Behind her, she could feel Aldrich's steady presence, the warmth of his support like a shield against her fears. Ahead lay either triumph or disaster, either the birth of a new age or the beginning of a war that would consume everything she'd come to love. The great doors to the balcony stood before them, and beyond those doors the future waited to be written. "Whatever happens," Aldrich murmured against her ear as they paused at the threshold, "and know that you've already changed everything. You've already won." Then the doors opened, and Princess Elira stepped forward to meet her destiny. The roar of the crowd hit them like a physical force as they stepped onto the great balcony. Thousands of faces turned upward, a sea of humanity stretching as far as the eye could see across the festival square. The traditional harvest banners snapped in the autumn breeze, their bright colors creating a tapestry of celebration that should have been purely joyous. But Elira could feel the undercurrent of tension threading through the crowd like a poison. Somewhere down there, Lord Blackthorn and his assassins waited for their moment to strike. The knowledge made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to maintain the serene expression that Lord Cassius had coached her to perfect. King Aldrich stepped forward first, raising his hand for silence. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, a display of love and loyalty that spoke to his 20 years of just rule. When the cheering finally subsided, his voice carried clearly across the vast square. "My people," he began, his tone warm but formal, "we gathered today not only to celebrate the harvest that sustains our bodies, but to plant seeds for a harvest that will sustain our children's future." A murmur of curiosity rippled through the crowd. This was not the traditional festival address they'd been expecting. For too long, our kingdom has stood alone, strong in our independence, but limited by our isolation. Today, I present to you an opportunity to change that, to build something greater than any single realm could achieve alone. He paused, his silver eyes finding Elira's face, and she saw the love there alongside the steel of his resolve. "I present to you Princess Elira of the Eastern Realm, daughter of the late King Aldwin Ravencrest, rightful heir to the Eastern Throne, and the woman who will stand beside me as we forge a new future for both our peoples." The silence that followed was deafening. For a heartbeat, Elira thought the crowd hadn't understood what they'd just heard. Then the murmur began, confused whispers that grew into a rumble of shock and speculation. This was her moment. Elira stepped forward to the balcony's edge, and as she did, servants unfurled the battle standard of unity. its intertwined wolf and eagle catching the morning sunlight. The symbolism was unmistakable, and she heard the crowd's intake of breath as they understood what they were witnessing. "I know this comes as a shock," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite her racing heart. 3 weeks ago, I didn't know the truth myself. I was just a woman living quietly at the kingdom's edge, tending to wounded travelers and trying to find peace in solitude." She touched the locket at her throat, the gesture visible to even the farthest reaches of the crowd. But blood calls to blood, and truth has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. "I am the daughter of King Aldwyn Ravencrest and Lady Lyanna of Westmere. I was hidden away as a child to prevent the very war that revealing my existence now could either start or prevent." The crowd was hanging on every word now, their attention absolute. But Elira could see movement in the far sections, figures pushing through the press of bodies with purposeful intent. "Blackthorn's people getting into position. You have a choice," she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "You can reject me as a threat to the stability you've known, as an outsider trying to claim power she hasn't earned. And if you do, I will accept that judgment and disappear from your lives forever." A woman near the front of the crowd called out, "What's the other choice, Your Highness?" The title sent a flutter through Elira's chest, but she pressed on. "The other choice is to embrace the possibility of something unprecedented. 2 kingdoms, united not through conquest or political manipulation, but through love and mutual respect. A union that makes us stronger together than we ever could be apart." That's when she saw him, Lord Blackthorn, standing near a group of young men whose hands rested too casually on concealed weapons. His eyes met hers across the crowd, and she saw murder in them, cold and determined. But she also saw something else: fear. He was afraid of what she represented, afraid of the changes her existence would bring to his carefully ordered world of privilege and conspiracy. That fear had driven him to attempted murder, to treason, to desecrating the sacred festival with plans for violence. "Some of you may have heard rumors about attempts on my life," she said, her gaze never leaving Blackthorn's face. "About conspiracies designed to prevent this moment from ever occurring." "Those rumors are true." A gasp went up from the crowd. This was not the carefully sanitized political theater they were accustomed to, but raw truth spoken without artifice. There are people in this very crowd who came here today not to celebrate our harvest, but to ensure I never live to see another sunset. They believe that fear and violence are stronger than hope and cooperation. Now she could see Blackthorn's group moving more urgently through the crowd, their cover blown by her direct challenge. But she also saw Master Garrett's agents closing in from multiple directions, the trap that had been weeks in the making finally springing shut. "I say they are wrong," Elira declared, her voice ringing with conviction that seemed to electrify the entire square. "I say that the strength of our people lies not in the sharpness of our swords, but in the depth of our compassion, not in our ability to destroy our enemies, but in our wisdom to transform them into allies." The unity crown, hastily forged but gleaming with symbolic power, was brought forward on a velvet cushion. This was the moment of greatest danger, when the ceremony would make her most vulnerable to attack. She could see Blackthorn's assassins pushing desperately through the crowd, their weapons now visible as they abandoned subtlety for speed. But King Aldrich was ready for them. "Guards," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years on the throne. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Guards, who had been positioned throughout the crowd, moved as one, surrounding and subduing the conspirators before they could complete their murderous mission. The crowd, realizing they were witnessing not just a political ceremony, but an actual battle for their kingdom's future, pressed back to give the guards room to work. Lord Blackthorn himself was tackled by 3 guards just yards from the platform where Elira stood. As he was dragged away, his poison ring clearly visible on his struggling hand, he shouted accusations that carried clearly in the crisp air. "She's a pretender, a threat to everything we've built. She'll destroy us all." But his words fell on deaf ears. The crowd had seen the truth of his intentions, had witnessed the violence he'd planned to bring to their sacred festival. Whatever credibility his accusations might have carried was destroyed by his own actions. "This," Elira said, gesturing toward the captured conspirators, "is what fear looks like. This is what happens when people choose division over unity. Violence over peace." She lifted the unity crown from its cushion, feeling its weight, not just as a physical object, but as a symbol of everything she was choosing to become. "I choose differently," she declared, "and I pray that you will choose with me." The moment stretched like eternity as Elira held the unity crown above her head, the morning sunlight catching its silver and gold in a display that seemed to set the very air ablaze. Thousands of faces stared up at her, the crowd so silent that the autumn breeze rustling through the banners sounded like thunder. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the vast assembly, a single voice called out, "Princess Elira!" The cry was taken up by another voice, then another, until it became a wave of sound that rolled across the square like an incoming tide. "Princess Elira! Princess Elira!" But it was what happened next that would be remembered for generations to come. As the crowd's chant grew louder and more unified, Elira felt something she had never experienced before, her empathic abilities responding not to individual pain or fear, but to collective hope and joy. The thousands of hearts beating in the square below seemed to synchronize with her own, creating a resonance that made the very stones beneath her feet vibrate with shared purpose. The unity crown in her hands began to glow with a soft, warm light that had nothing to do with the morning sun. The crowd gasped in wonder as they witnessed something that had passed from reality into legend centuries ago, the manifestation of true royal authority, recognized and blessed by the will of the people themselves. King Aldrich stepped beside her, his own voice joining the crowd's chant, but with words that carried across the square like a bell. "Behold your princess. Behold your future queen." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The chant evolved, becoming something deeper and more profound. "Long live the princess. Long live the king. Long live the unity." But even as triumph swelled around them, Elira's empathic senses detected something else, a final, desperate surge of malevolent intent from the area where the captured conspirators were being held. Lord Blackthorn, despite his restraints, was making one last attempt to complete his murderous mission. She saw him break free from his guards with the strength of desperation, his poison ring now openly displayed as he lunged toward a child in the crowd, a little girl who had been lifted onto her father's shoulders for a better view. His intent was clear. If he couldn't kill the princess directly, he would murder an innocent to create chaos and turn the crowd's joy into horror. Time seemed to slow as Elira watched the tragedy unfold. The guards were too far away, the crowd too dense for anyone to reach the child in time. In seconds, poison would claim an innocent life, and the moment of unity would dissolve into panic and grief. But Elira was no longer the powerless Omega who had lived in exile for 8 years. She was a princess who had discovered the true extent of her gifts, and she had no intention of allowing evil to triumph on this day, without conscious thought. She reached out with her empathic abilities, not just to read emotions this time, but to project them. Every ounce of love she had ever felt, every moment of hope and healing she had experienced, every drop of compassion that had sustained her through years of loneliness and rejection. She poured it all into the connection that linked her to every heart in the square. The effect was instantaneous and miraculous. Lord Blackthorn stumbled as if struck by a physical blow, his murderous rage suddenly overwhelmed by an emotion he had not felt in decades, genuine remorse. The poison ring slipped from nerveless fingers as he was flooded with the understanding of what his actions would cost, not just in the death of a child, but in the destruction of hope itself. He collapsed to his knees, weeping as the full weight of his crimes crashed over him. Around him, the crowd that had been pressed back in fear now moved forward with compassion, their anger at his treachery tempered by an inexplicable understanding of the pain that had driven him to such desperate measures. The little girl, safely caught by dozens of reaching hands, looked around in wonder at the adults who surrounded her with such gentle protectiveness. In her innocence, she began to clap her hands in delight at what she perceived as an elaborate game, her laughter ringing across the square like the sound of silver bells. That laughter broke the spell of intensity that had gripped the crowd, transforming the moment from high drama into something far more precious, genuine joy shared by thousands of people who had just witnessed their world change for the better. "This," Elira said, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the emotional exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her, "is what unity looks like. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of compassion, strong enough to transform conflict into understanding." She placed the unity crown on her head, with hands that trembled only slightly, feeling its weight settle onto her brow like the touch of destiny itself. But it was when King Aldrich took her hand that she felt the true significance of the moment. Not just her individual transformation from exile to princess, but their joint commitment to building something that had never existed before. "Citizens of the northern and eastern realms," Aldrich declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "I present to you Princess Elira, rightful heir to the Eastern throne, healer of hearts, and the woman who will stand beside me as we forge a new future built on the strength of unity rather than the weakness of division." The crowd's response shattered every precedent for royal ceremonies. Instead of the formal cheers and ritual acknowledgments that protocol demanded, they began to sing, a spontaneous harmony that rose from thousands of voices without direction or rehearsal. It was a song of harvest, of gratitude, of hope for the future that their children would inherit. As the song swelled around them, Elira felt the broken pieces of her life finally falling into place. The shame of her failed bonding, the years of exile and loneliness, the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks, all of it had led to this moment when she could offer not just herself, but a vision of what their world could become. The shattered poison ring lay forgotten in the dust at Lord Blackthorn's feet, its malevolent power broken by the simple force of love, triumphing over hatred. The battle standard of unity snapped proudly in the breeze above them, its intertwined symbols no longer just hopeful imagery, but a promise being fulfilled before their eyes. In the distance, riders could be seen approaching at speed, messengers from the Eastern Kingdom, carrying news that would confirm what the crowd had already accepted in their hearts. The legitimate nobility of the Eastern realm, led by those who had remained loyal to King Aldwin's memory, had officially recognized Princess Elira's claim and endorsed the union between the kingdoms. The revolution was complete, achieved not through conquest or political manipulation, but through the simple power of truth, spoken with courage and received with open hearts. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, carrying news of what they had witnessed to every corner of both realms, Elira and Aldrich remained on the balcony, hands clasped, watching their people celebrate the dawn of a new age. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his thumb tracing across her knuckles with infinite tenderness. "Only one," she replied, leaning into his strength. "Which is?" Her smile was radiant with joy and exhaustion in equal measure. "That it took us so long to find each other." The sound of celebration continued to rise from the square below, but gradually it was joined by another sound, wedding bells beginning to ring from the castle's highest tower, announcing to the world that the age of unity had truly begun. 3 months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the castle battlements, Queen Elira stood at the window of what had once been her simple guest chambers and was now the royal suite she shared with her husband. The transformation was remarkable not just in the grandeur of her surroundings, but in the profound changes that had rippled across both kingdoms since that pivotal day at the Harvest Festival. The wedding had taken place just 2 weeks after her public coronation, a ceremony that managed to be both magnificently royal and genuinely intimate. Instead of the elaborate crown jewels that tradition demanded, Elira had chosen to wear the simple silver circlet from her coronation alongside. A wedding ring that Aldrich had commissioned from the castle's forge, plain gold, bands that spoke to their preference for substance over spectacle. Those simple wedding rings now caught the morning light as she turned from the window to survey the reports that covered her writing desk. The administrative details of unifying two kingdoms were staggering in their complexity, but the work was deeply satisfying in ways she had never expected. The grain shipments from the eastern provinces arrived yesterday, she told Aldrich as he emerged from their adjoining chamber, dressed for the day's council meetings. The harvest sharing program is exceeding all our projections. It had been her idea to establish regular trade exchanges between the kingdom's agricultural regions, ensuring that neither realm would face the kind of famine that had historically driven them to war. The program's success had surprised even their most optimistic advisors, proving that cooperation could indeed generate prosperity that benefited everyone involved. And the joint military exercises? He asked, moving behind her chair to read the reports over her shoulder. Lord Commander Thane reports excellent progress. The officers from both kingdoms are working together more effectively than anyone dared hope. She leaned back against his chest, still marveling at the simple joy of being able to touch him freely. Though he does mention some initial challenges with different fighting techniques, the creation of a unified defense force had been one of their most ambitious undertakings, requiring not just military reorganization, but a fundamental shift in how both kingdoms viewed security and sovereignty. Instead of maintaining separate armies that faced each other across contested borders, they were building something unprecedented. A joint force dedicated to protecting both realms from external threats while maintaining internal peace. What about our other project? Aldrich asked quietly, his arms encircling her waist with familiar warmth. Elira smiled and placed her hands over his, feeling the contentment that had become her constant companion over these past months. Master Garrett's intelligence network has identified 17 young people with empathic abilities across both kingdoms. We're bringing them to the castle for training next spring. This initiative was perhaps closest to her heart, the establishment of a formal program to identify, train, and honor those born with the rare gifts that had once made her an outcast. Instead of hiding their abilities or being shamed into exile, these young empaths would be taught to use their gifts in service of healing and understanding. Any word from Lord Blackthorn? Aldrich inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He's made remarkable progress. The healers at the monastery say his remorse appears genuine, and he's asked permission to dedicate his remaining years to caring for orphaned children. Elira shook her head in wonder at the transformation. Sometimes, I think that moment at the festival changed him more than it changed anyone else. The decision to spare Blackthorn's life and offer him redemption instead of execution had been controversial, but it had also set a tone for the new era they were building, one that valued transformation over retribution, healing over punishment. The man who had once plotted her assassination now spent his days teaching reading to children who had lost their parents to war and poverty. A knock at the door interrupted their quiet morning planning session. "Come," Elira called, settling back into her chair as Lord Cassius entered. With his usual collection of reports and correspondence, "Your Majesties," he said with a bow that had grown notably warmer over the months since her coronation. The morning's dispatches include several items of particular interest. He handed over a leather satchel bearing the seal of the Eastern Kingdom's Provisional Council. Official confirmation that the last of the Loyalist holds have formally recognized the Union. Your authority as Queen of the Eastern Realm is now uncontested. This news, while expected, still sent a thrill of satisfaction through Elira. The political unification of the kingdoms was finally complete, accomplished not through conquest, but through the gradual winning of hearts and minds. Also, Lord Cassius continued with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "A letter from your former cottage." Elira looked up sharply, accepting the simple paper with hands that trembled slightly. She had maintained the cottage as a retreat, visiting it monthly to ensure its upkeep. But she hadn't expected correspondence from that direction. The letter was from the young man she had healed just before. The king's fateful arrival, the frightened boy who had given her a carved bird as thanks for her help. He wrote to inform her that he had established a way station at the mountain crossroads, offering shelter and healing to travelers just as she once had. More significantly, he had gathered a small community of other outcasts and refugees who were working together to provide sanctuary for those the rest of the world had forgotten. "He says he's named it Haven's Rest," she told Aldrich, her voice thick with emotion. "And he's signed it, Your Grateful Student." The letter represented something profound, proof that the changes they had initiated were spreading far beyond the formal structures of government and politics. The simple kindness she had practiced in isolation was now being multiplied by others who understood its value. "There's more," Lord Cassius said, producing another document with obvious satisfaction. "The final reports from this year's census. The population growth, economic indicators, and general prosperity measurements all show the same thing." Elira accepted the summary with growing amazement. In just 3 months since unification, both kingdoms had experienced unprecedented growth in every measure of citizen welfare. Trade had increased by 40%. Marriage rates had risen dramatically, and most significantly, the number of children born in the past months suggested a level of optimism about the future that neither realm had known in generations. "People are having babies," Aldrich observed with wonder. "They believe strongly enough in our future to bring children into this world." The simple statement hit Elira with unexpected force. These were not abstract political achievements or economic statistics. They were the most intimate expression of faith possible. Thousands of couples had looked at the world being built around them and decided it was safe enough, hopeful enough to entrust with their most precious dreams. "Speaking of which," she said carefully, meeting her husband's eyes with a mixture of joy and nervousness, "there's something I need to tell you." The change in Aldrich's expression was immediate and profound. Hope, wonder, and pure joy warred for dominance on his features as he understood what she was suggesting. "Are you certain?" he whispered. The court physician confirmed it yesterday. Her smile was radiant with happiness. "We're going to have a child, Aldrich. An heir who will be born into the United Kingdom we've built, who will never know a world where the realms were divided by fear and suspicion." He lifted her from her chair and spun her in a circle, both of them laughing with the pure joy of the moment. When he finally set her down, his hands cupped her face with infinite tenderness. "A child who will be raised with love instead of duty, who will understand that true strength comes from compassion, who will inherit not just our crowns, but our commitment to building bridges instead of walls." Lord Cassius, who had been tactfully examining the ceiling during their intimate exchange, cleared his throat gently. "If I may, Your Majesties, this news will be received with great celebration throughout both kingdoms. The continuation of the royal line ensures the stability of everything we've built." But Elira was thinking beyond politics and succession. She was imagining a child who would grow up knowing that love could triumph over hatred, that outcasts could become queens, that the most powerful magic was the ability to heal rather than harm. A child who would be living proof that second chances were possible, that broken hearts could mend stronger than before. As the day progressed and the news of their expected heir spread throughout the castle, Elira found herself returning again and again to the window that overlooked the kingdom she now called home. The autumn landscape was preparing for winter's rest, but everywhere she looked, she could see signs of the growth and renewal that had characterized these past months. In the distance, She could just make out the road that led to her former cottage, the path that had brought Aldrich into her life during that storm-tossed night that seemed like a lifetime ago. She touched the locket at her throat, feeling her parents' love across the years, then placed her hand on her stomach, where new life was growing. "What are you thinking about?" Aldrich asked, joining her at the window as the afternoon light began to fade. "About storms," she replied thoughtfully. "About how they can destroy everything in their path, but they can also bring unexpected gifts to those wise enough to offer shelter." His arm encircled her shoulders, pulling her close against his side. "Any regrets about the life you left behind? The simplicity, the solitude, the peace of your cottage?" Elira considered the question seriously, looking back over the extraordinary journey that had brought her from exile to queenship, from rejection to acceptance, from loneliness to love. "I miss the quiet sometimes," she admitted, "but I wouldn't trade this for anything. Not the complexity, not the responsibility, not even the constant awareness that our choices affect the lives of thousands." "Why?" She turned in his arms, looking up into the silver eyes that had first recognized her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong. Not just accepted, but needed. Not just loved, but valued for the gifts that once made me an outcast." The sun was setting over their united kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to promise even brighter dawns to come. Somewhere in the castle below, the evening bells were beginning to ring, calling people to their dinners, to their families, to their simple, secure lives in a world where unity had triumphed over division. "Home," Elira whispered, the word carrying all the weight of dreams finally fulfilled. "Home," Aldrich agreed, his voice warm with the contentment of a man who had found not just love, but purpose worthy of a lifetime's dedication, and in the distance, carried on the evening breeze like a promise of spring to come, came the sound of children playing in the castle courtyard, children who would grow up in a world where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where strength was measured by the capacity to heal rather than harm, where even the most unlikely love stories could become the foundation for a kingdom's hope. The rejected Omega had become a beloved queen, but more than that, she had become proof that every heart has value, every soul deserves love, and every ending can be the beginning of something even more beautiful. As night fell over the United Kingdoms, Queen Elira and King Aldrich stood together at their window, hands clasped, hearts joined, watching over the realm they had built with nothing more powerful than faith in the possibility that love could indeed conquer all. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the peace they had fought so hard to achieve, they both knew with absolute certainty that they were home at last.